A few minutes ago, we talked about bias that can occur in samples, biased and unbiased samples. And now we're going to take a look at biased and unbiased survey questions. Of course, survey is one of our three study techniques. We've got a survey, we have an observational study, we have an experiment. And when we design a survey, it is possible to introduce bias. And what you want to avoid bias, to stay clear of bias in your survey questions are a number of things. One, we can have bias in the survey question if the question is confusing. We also can introduce bias if we're encouraging the members of that sample to answer in a certain way. Our question might evoke or introduce a strong reaction that would create bias in a survey question. And if we are introducing more than one issue, that would also introduce bias into a survey question. So let's take a look here at a couple of scenarios, and we're going to see if we can identify from survey questions whether they are biased or unbiased, and if they're biased, we're going to explain our reasoning. So let's look at the first one here. So here's a survey question. Do you like animals? And would you ever consider a dog, a cat, or a hamster as a pet? Well, now remember, one of our conditions of something that can introduce bias into a survey question is if we are addressing more than one issue. And so in this example, well, the first part of our question is, do you like animals? Well, that's a yes or no question. And if that was by itself, that would be fine. And then it comes back and says, would you ever consider a dog, a cat, or a hamster as a pet? Well, that's the second issue. And in fact, within the second issue, we've got 1, 2, 3 issues. And so we're going to have to say that this question is biased because it is asking about 2 issues. Do you like animals? And then would you consider, and then you have 3 choices as a pet. That in itself, the second part of that survey question is also biased. So we got a double bias right there. Let's take a look at one more. How much do you spend working on schoolwork each night? Well, that's a simple question. There's a certain amount of time you might have that your behavior may indicate. And so therefore we could say that this is actually an unbiased question. It's not confusing. It's not really encouraging answer a certain way. You can say, I don't spend any time working on schoolwork. It doesn't really give a strong reaction unless you hate schoolwork that much. I guess that could be a strong reaction, but not in the context of what we're talking about. And it does not introduce more than one issue. So we can have bias in a sample. We can have bias in a survey. And the next up, we're going to talk about the possibility of bias in an experiment. If it's an observational study, there's really not bias. You're really just observing. Although I guess you could possibly have bias in your sample, depending on what you're observing.